Hey guys, my name is Olga Turner Brez. The movie that I chose was Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and the theory that I chose was intimate partner violence. So the reason why I chose the movie was just because it was the first one that popped out at me, and it was just one of my favorite movies. If you haven't seen it, it was written in 2005. It's about a married heterosexual couple who end up finding out that they're assassins for competing agencies and end up being each other's targets. And the reason why I chose that theory was just because I thought it best fit the movie. Now, intimate partner violence, it's defined by World Health Organizations as domestic violence or abuse by a former or current partner or spouse. Now, the abuse could be physical, verbal, emotional, economical, or sexual. It was difficult to find the origin of intimate partner violence, and that's just because it was a subcategory of a much older term that I was able to find a lot more research on. The older term was domestic violence, which is interchangeable with domestic abuse. So the first time I was able to find any kind of records in history of domestic abuse or violence was in 1641, and it was written in the Massachusetts Body of Liberties by Nathaniel Ward. So it was a law that was written back in the Puritan days when the colonies, before the colonies became United States. So it was a law that was protecting women from being, or married women from being beaten by their husbands. Now, I didn't find domestic abuse or violence again in history until I found research by Jules Fortman. And it was basically domestic violence during the 19th century, during the first wave of feminist movement, which took over the United States, the UK, and other countries. I didn't see intimate partner violence until I saw research by Dr. Ron Wallace, who is a professor of criminal justice at the American Military University. So the term intimate partner violence wasn't introduced until the 2000s, so it's actually pretty recent. And it was created in order to be more inclusive of intimate relationships, like same-sex couples and couples that are not yet married. Intimate partner violence, it can be detrimental to relationships for obvious reasons, but basically the abused person ends up being controlled and only speaks or states what they think the abuser wants to hear. And the abuser tends to result to violence instead of communicating in nonviolent ways. So you can find many examples of that in the movie. So the first example I found was when Jane and John sit down for dinner, and this is just after they find out that they're assassins for competing agencies. So Jane makes John his favorite dish, which was pot roast, and she waits for John to take that first bite. So as John does, he sees in the mirror, he's able to see different kinds of poisonous chemicals in the kitchen. So this is definitely an example of either physical or emotional abuse. So the reason why I think it's physical, and it's either or just because we don't know for a fact if Jane poisoned his food or not. So if she did poison his food, it's definitely an example of physical abuse. That's just because she's trying to kill him. And if she didn't, then it's definitely emotional abuse just because she's messing with his head, making it seem as if she's trying to kill him or not. Later on, there's another scene where Jane thinks that she's already killed John, but John appears and he asks her to dance. So this scene has definitely at least 3 examples of abuse, if not more. But the first example of abuse that I see is Jane saying verbal abuse to John, basically calling him a sloth. And then John reciprocates that with physical abuse, crushing her hand as he picks her up and then pushing her into a mirror as they're dancing. Then later on, John continues with the abuse, this being now verbal abuse, and stating that he hasn't been happy in their marriage for 5 to 6 years. Later on, there is an example of physical abuse again, and that's just when they're on their way from the dancing scene to their home that they shared before, where they start trying to kill each other using guns, and then it leads to hand-to-hand combat. So these are the examples that I have.